installing a Tremec T56 Magnum transmission in a classic muscle car can be a real pain if you don't know what you're getting yourself into. It gets a little trickier in a first-gen Camaro, especially with a Detroit Speed subframe that moves the motor back towards the firewall. I've been hard at work raising the tunnel and fabricating a custom-shaped firewall. Today, we're going to focus on the hump and make it all work. If you've been stumped by the hump, this video is for you. There's a huge opportunity in this area. Buckle up, Bubbaloo. Let's get moving. Before we jump in, let's pump the brakes to better understand the challenge. If you want a Tremec 6-speed, just know that you're in for some custom fab work to make it fit. You'll need to raise the tunnel about 2 inches for clearance. But the real headache is the hump, where the raised tunnel meets the firewall. There's a lot of different angles and curves coming together here. It's gonna challenge your metalworking skills. I've raised the stakes on my build by going with a full custom firewall, and I'm completely ditching what's left here. We'll get into that shortly. That said, I need to plan this out to make sure it all works. And if that's not enough, it's gotta look sexy.
I'm bringing sexy back.
So what things do you need to consider? In my case, I have a Detroit Speed subframe that'll be mounted to the body with DSE solid body mounts. I'll be running an LSX engine with DSE motor mounts that locate the engine 1.5 inches further back. That means the bell is located deeper in the hump. It's critical that you provide enough clearance in this area so you can adjust the motor and trans to get the correct driveline angles. There's all kinds of stuff that comes into play in this area, like a vintage air system, pedal assembly, even a harness pass-through. You need to flush it all out. Let's take a closer look at what we're starting with today. And where we are today is with a blank slate of a 14 gauge sheet of mild steel with TIG welded flanges, tight to the cowl shoulders and tight to the torque boxes, ready to be welded. Both sides, nice and clean. Lovely fit. And it's by no accident that I've left a lot of extra material here in the lower center. And that extra material affords me plenty of flexibility to advance the design of the hump and to marry these new toe boards up to the flush firewall. I bought this LS dummy block from Speedway Motors and mounted it to my Detroit Speed subframe. I'm not ready to pop the body off the jig. So how do you reference what you need with all this in the way? Instead of moving the subframe under the car, I'll simply take the firewall to the subframe. That's why I haven't welded anything. My firewall extends down to the frame. I'll reference the pin locators on the torque box to line things up. Let's remove the firewall. I'll take the clecos out. You want to see how good the fit is? I'll remove this last cleco holding everything on. Nothing moves. You gotta love a precise fit. I'm gonna pop it off, take it over to the subframe. Rest it on the body mounts and line up the marks. And lean it against the dummy block. Center lines match, check. You can see I have the bottom mount for the rad support in the pin locator position, because it's more or less the same height as the mount. Context is king. The center hole of this top bell mounting point is about 10 inches down from the top of my firewall. The bell's hanging down off the jig. It's the same 10 inches down from the top of the firewall to the center of that mounting bolt. You can clearly see what the problem is. The driveline angle is 13 to 14 degrees out. I've cut the bell flange out of some cardstock and hung it down the same 10 inches from the top of the firewall. You can see what you're up against. The top of the hump, clearly in the way, and even some of these sides, depending on the taper of the transmission, which we'll figure out. But this squiggle at the top, in the way. It's gotta go. And one last nugget. If you're going with DSE half-height solid body mounts, that would push this bell up another 1/2 inch. Where do you get this kind of insight? Come on, smash that subscribe button. Let's mark the outline with this thick Sharpie. It'll get us in the neighborhood. I'll trace along the heads and down. Mark the mounting bolt so I can reference the bell. And voila!
Ooh la la.
You can see I drew the bell on too. Let's review some of the key measurements. So the bell out to out is about 18 inches, and the inner diameter furthest back is about 9 inches. The flange with the radius is about 1.5 inches. That top mounting bolt down from the top of the firewall, in my instance, is 10 inches. You can see the heads, the valley of the manifold, and the extents of the block more or less roughed into place in the neighborhood. Now I got to decide how much clearance I can accommodate and plan out the sheet metal. Okay, I've mocked everything up here. You can see I did steering column poking through on the swivel mount, the Wilwood master cylinder on the DSC mount kit, and my master power brakes 9-inch booster with the level mount. Now I can turn my attention to the passenger side. The last component to flush out is this vintage air evaporator module. Problem is, I've lost all the factory reference holes to locate the mount. Lucky I saved this. And with my jig, 10 inches down to the center of the fender bolt and level it across. The vintage air instructions call out these two heater box holes as reference. But, like the I Did It swivel steering mount, I don't want to bolt through the firewall to mount this. DSC makes one for a 69 Camaro, but you're on your own with a 67 or 68. If you've ever had the pleasure to weld on the hump, you know it's very easy to blow through in this area. Why? Because the factory firewall is stamped out of a single sheet of metal, and these contours are stretched thin. Flying back in the day with a couple few hundred horsepower and bias ply tires, but for what I'm planning, I need the body rigid so the DSC suspension can do its work as designed. The firewall is a key structural component. It cross braces the front of the car and resists torsion or twisting forces. To combat those forces, the center of the mass also needs to be the center of stiffness. To that end, I don't want to make simple, angled, butt welded joints in this area. It would be easier, but I see that as a missed opportunity. Anytime you break away from a factory look, you risk coming up with a detail that doesn't suit the car. Factory purists will be put off no matter what you do. But that's not my point. And I'm in no way, shape, or form a factory purist, not my jam. On the other end of the spectrum, you have those that flex their fabrication muscle and come up with details that are so different and personal that to the mass majority, it simply looks off or out of place. Which is okay. It's your car and you gotta do you. Indulge me for a minute, I wanna make a point. I'm an architect by training, and from my design perspective, it doesn't matter. Buildings or cars. Everything has its own design language. Lines, curves, shapes, and most importantly, proportions. And all the various details of the car comprise that specific language. You try and do too much or stray too far from what's already been established in terms of that language, and you risk losing the essence of what you started with. I'll be honest, I've been struggling with the direction of my build and how far I want to take things as a result of this detail. So I've let things percolate, as I'm fond of saying, for quite some time now. I started this video over 6 months ago. It's amazing what opportunities present when you're open to them and look at things from a different perspective. With added rigidity and safety in mind, I took inspiration from drag racing and looked at the various roll cages and tube chassis out there. I've decided to add to my DSC 4-point roll cage kit and fab a full 6 or 8-point cage. The cage will definitely add more rigidity, but more importantly, an extra element of safety. So I've decided to add a tube to reinforce this area. Weld torque box to torque box, brace across there and along the toe boards, and then the upper part of the tube is the underside of the transmission hump. Tube will be welded to the 14 gauge firewall and to the toe boards and to the torque boxes, and becomes the basis for the design of the hump. I plan to tie that tube back to the cage and the dash bar so it's one integral structure. I think it's a win-win detail. The little weight that that bar adds to my overall assembly is negligible, and I think the strength that it affords and getting away from arbitrary sheet metal connections into something a lot more rigid and fluid, it's a win-win. Because I've already mocked my pedal assembly and steering column in, I know that that bar will not interfere with pedal travel, because the floor would normally be in front of this bar, and we have to extend the floor beyond and out to the firewall. Okay, the firewall is not symmetrical. The driver's side is pushed in compared to the passenger side. So we're pulling this side out a little further, and that bar tucks in there beautifully. Bonus points if I can integrate a custom vintage air mount into the mix. If you follow me on Instagram, you'll know that I bought this Bailey tube bender a little while ago. I posted some pics. There's a method to my madness. I bought this for a reason. I had this modification in mind. So let's bend some tube. Well, here's my prototype bar bent to the angles. Worked out famously. I drafted up that paper template in CAD with some measurements and was able to measure all the angles and the radiuses, transferred it to the tube, and bent it to match. The angles of these bends, because I'm building a 67 Camaro, are 67 degrees. It was like it was meant to be. Anyways, worked out fine. Now I just need to whittle the ends to get this to fit tight as I'm going back and forth and getting you dizzy. But I also have to remove some of this interference here. The torque boxes bow in, so I'm going to have to flatten some of this area out, get rid of some of the interference here so that I can position this flush against the firewall and tight into the floor bends. And that's the next step. Well, I wouldn't want to be doing this crawling around on the floor. Heck of a lot easier sitting on a stool accessing the firewall. Well, I've moved all the metal and the bar is sitting flush against the firewall. Looking good. Okay. There we go. My 14 gauge comes down around this torque box anyways, but I'll weld that up and close it up prior to welding the 14 gauge up against it. To section this out, lots of material to tie back into. I think this is going to work famously. If you're just starting your custom firewall or transmission tunnel, you'll want to check out one of those two videos. I think I'm going to end this one here. Be sure to hit subscribe and ring that bell so you get notified when part 2 drops soon. Cheers.